Okay, hi everybody. So this is going to be a brief overview of basic user interface for ZBrush, so you guys are clear on how to navigate around, and also just to kind of keep you guys in the confines of the areas that we're going to be staying within ZBrush, since it can be a pretty big program and kind of daunting. You know, the learning curve is, well, not the easiest learning curve. So I want to make sure that we keep it really structured in a way that keeps you guys confined to the areas that we need and stay away from the areas that we don't. Okay, so hopefully this will be a good point of reference for that. So I've launched ZBrush, and off the bat, what I have here is the default user interface. Now, some of you, hopefully everyone has the custom user interface that I've provided in class. If you don't, we'll work on getting that to you as a permanent option. In the meantime, I'm just going to stay with this, and probably at the end of this, I'll go ahead and load that UI. So real quick, when you launch ZBrush, let me just talk about file management real quick. There's a few different ways to save your files, one being a ZBrush project. Another is actually saving a tool, which in the world of ZBrush, geometry or a model is referred to as a subtool, or Z tool as the file would be called. So let's go ahead and load something. I'm going to hit comma on my keyboard to bring up the, give me 1 second here, to bring up Lightbox. And so hitting comma on the keyboard will basically toggle on and off Lightbox. So you have easy access to navigate into our tool menu, which is right up here. In this menu, you're going to have a lot of different types of geometry you can start with. As mentioned in the class, I'm trying to keep you guys in the habit of starting with really basic primitives. So I'm going to go ahead and double click on this polysphere. And what that's essentially doing is loading that Z tool within my tool palette here. So you'll see as I'm hovering over here that I have a Z tool of my polysphere loaded, as well as some other just kind of default objects that get introduced here. So when I first started ZBrush and I went ahead and scrubbed in my canvas here, it dropped this sphere, or I'm sorry, this square. So I don't want that. And right now, since I'm not in 3D edit mode, I'm going to go ahead and clear this canvas by hitting Control N. So that way we have a nice clear slate. Now, what I mean by that is that right now, I am not actually in a 3D space. If I was to go ahead and draw out this polysphere, which I do have selected in my tool palette, I wouldn't be able to rotate it just yet. Like right now, if I drag my cursor off in space and start moving it around, you'll see that all I'm doing is introducing multiple spheres. So right now it's being treated, the canvas is being treated as a 2D canvas. So we don't want that. So the easy way to basically get away from that, I'm going to go ahead and clear it again by hitting Control N. So now let's go ahead and take that tool. I'm going to go ahead and drag it out. And right now, immediately, if I hit T, T is the hotkey, but here in the default UI, right at the top where you see this edit button, if I hit that button, it's essentially the same thing as hitting T. And at this point, I can basically now move my object around, rotate it around in space, dolly around and zoom in. Now, just some quick navigation in the viewport on how to do this stuff. So if you take your cursor off into space, and that's anywhere in space, not on top of the object, but actually out in space. And in my case, I'm using a Cintiq, so I can just click down on my stylus and I can basically move this thing around. But for those of you who are on a mouse, just left mouse button click in space, you'll be able to move your object around. Now, at the same time, if I hold down Alt and then left mouse button, I can dolly around. So it's a good way to position your model anywhere in that space. And then lastly, if I hold down Control and left mouse button, I can zoom in or out. So between those three operations, just clicking down with my mouse off in space, holding down Alt and doing the same, and holding down Control and doing the same, I get the different functions there. Now, a couple of really handy shortcuts that are going to be really, really useful for you guys is that anytime as I'm moving this object around in space, if I hit Shift right now and then click off in space, you'll notice that the object actually snaps to whatever camera is closest, whatever orthographic camera is closest. So in this case, I'll move it around just like this. I'm sorry, I got it a little bit off-centered. If I hold down Shift, you'll notice that my cursor turns bluish, and I'm just going to click to the right, and it's basically snapping it to my front camera. Okay, so it's something really handy to do. Now let's go over real quick just some of the basic UI areas that you should be comfortable with. Now, granted, this really depends on what UI you're using. If you're using my UI that I provided you guys, it's going to be a little bit different, so I'll cover that a little bit later. In the meantime, let's stick with the defaults. So in the upper left-hand corner where you see brush, this is where we're going to basically be able to grab any brush that we want to use to manipulate the geometry. So for example, if I go ahead and click on this palette, I'm going to get a whole arrangement of different brushes that are at my disposal. Now, most of what you're seeing here is everything that ships with ZBrush. I also have some others that I've installed, downloaded from third parties and just installed. So you may not see as many as you see right here. But at the top portion, the quick pick portion, these are typically the most used ones. So you'll kind of develop your own sense of brushes that you really, really like. So in this UI that I'm using here, you'll see that down at the bottom, there's a row of really handy ones that are already at my disposal here. So this is a combination of some really basic brushes that are really, really good, as well as some basic materials that are really, really good to use. So again, you can access brushes in multiple amount of ways. Either clicking on the brush right here, going down to the UI and clicking on any of these brushes, you can see that it basically activates the same menu. Now the keyboard shortcut for that, if I was to hit B right now, it'll bring up the same exact menu. Okay, so just real quick, that's the easy way to activate your brush menu and get yourself situated with the right brush. Moving down here on the left-hand side where you see the stroke. Now stroke basically is suggesting how you want the brush to basically react. Right now it's set to, what is this, dots? So that's going to be kind of a stagnated kind of freehand approach. This is pretty good for when you're just freely sculpting on geometry. You got drag rectangle, which is basically like dragging out the influence just 100% on geometry. These all serve different purposes, and I'll try to explain in practical use when I'm using what. So for the most part right now, depending on what brush is actually active, the stroke might actually change. So for example, if I go and change this to move, well, it actually stayed with dots as the stroke. Another one that you may see just get activated off the top would be freehand. And I think for the most part, between freehand and dots is what you're going to be using when you're actually sculpting. Down here in alpha, now alpha is basically very dependent on what brush you use. So for example, if I go down here and select this damn standard brush, you'll notice that now I have a different alpha that's being activated. Now that's because some brushes are dependent on different alphas for certain effects. You don't have to worry so much about this. There are practical uses for alphas down the line when you start detailing and things to that nature. But for what we're going to be doing in the onset is really, really most likely that this is going to be turned off. So I'll switch this back to move, and you'll see that now that alpha is gone. Texture, don't worry about this just yet. This really has to do with applying textures and turning them onto geometry that's been UV'd. We're not at that point yet, but we will be covering that a little bit later on. Okay, and then lastly, where you see the material right here, if I select that, this basically gives you a whole assortment of different materials you can apply to your geometry. So real quick, some of these are extra that I've installed, so you may not have the same amount of materials. That's something I'll try to provide for you guys. But if I go ahead and select a different material, so by default, this matte cap red wax material is what's going to be applied to your geometry. If I go down here, let's just select basic material, then immediately we're going to basically change that material property of that geometry. If you don't like that one, you can go and select whatever you like here. For example, here's a gold type of material. Now one thing to demonstrate between the materials, you have what's called matte cap materials, and then down here standard materials. Now I don't have really a particular preference to what you guys would use as you're sculpting. For myself, I tend to use something that's fairly neutral, that just shows the form quite nicely. One that I use quite often is this RS Oil Clay Red 02. Now that's something I'll provide you guys. It's not built into ZBrush, but you'll see if I select it, it kind of gives like this kind of putty type of feeling. And I find that it really just enhances the form in a way that's really nice for sculpting. Okay, so those are basic UI functions here on the left-hand side. And then, of course, this is basically a color swatch. So I can go in here and basically pick whatever color I like, and it'll affect the geometry depending on the shader that's applied. Now, one thing to note is as I'm picking colors, sometimes it may not actually read on the geometry the same color that you're picking in the swatch here. Now, the reason for that, if you look at the actual material I have assigned, there's already a pigment to it. Now, that's built into the shader. So if you want something that's going to be a true color representation, what I recommend is picking something that's inherently white. So a good one that I have here is this zbrush paint. I'll go ahead and select that. And you'll see that now that color is pretty much one-to-one. One thing to mention about some of these shaders that I'm applying is that they don't ship with ZBrush. So I will be sure to hand you guys these for those of you who want them, okay? As far as the standard materials are concerned, these do come shipped. So a safe one for you guys to use if you really want something that's basic but shows the form nicely. You can use skin shade is quite nice to just kind of give you a kind of that putty feel. And another one that I find myself using quite often is just basic material. You get a little bit of darker shading on that one, but it's still fairly nice. Okay, let me pause for a second and we'll start a new chapter here. All right, continuing on. So here's the next thing that I'd like to talk about here. So we've covered basic movement in the viewport, how to navigate around and kind of get going here. And then, of course, how to access brushes, how to change your strokes. Alphas we'll get into a little more later, and then, of course, materials, colors, and all that stuff. There's a lot of buttons that you're going to see around here that don't really serve any importance to us just yet, but as we get more comfortable within ZBrush, it'll be something that we spend a little more time using some different functions, okay? All right, so I have this geometry here. I have it dropped into canvas and I'm in edit mode. So I'm gonna go ahead and start manipulating this with a brush, and on the onset, you know, we're gonna be using move most likely to just kind of get some broad strokes. If I hold down the space bar, I'll be able to kind of bring up this little marking menu. It's a really nifty menu that has a complete assortment of different things that I can manipulate. Most importantly, draw size of the brush, the focal shift, which is essentially the radius of influence from that brush. RGB intensity is basically the color intensity of that brush. Typically you want that set to 100. And then the Z intensity is the intensity of the brush. Now most of the brushes have a default intensity. In this case, Move has a default of 51. That's a really nice setting for the Move brush. You may find that you want something a little less strong for other brushes. As we get into the sculpting aspects, I'll show you how some of that stuff responds. Now this is actually important here, the mRGB, RGB, M for material, Z add, Z sub. Let me explain what that is real quick. Now, in the default menu up here at the top, you're going to find that all this stuff is accessible as well. The main thing here is Z add is an additive function of a brush, whereas Z sub would be the negative of that, the inverse of that. So you could imagine if I have this right here, and just for a real quick practical purpose, I'm going to go ahead and subdivide this geometry so we have a little more resolution on here. The shortcut for that is Control D. So if I hit Control D, one thing you're going to notice here is that a message comes up and says, a 3D mesh with subdivision history may be fully subdivided only while the highest subdivision level is active. So what that's telling me is that, hey, this mesh actually has additional subdivisions or higher subdivisions, and I'm just not aware of it. So what I'm going to do is go into my geometry menu, and if you notice, there's actually subdivisions applied here. Now this is another menu we'll explore a little more in depth, but for right now, what's important is that you understand the difference here. So if I slide this little slider right here over, let's say all the way to the far right, you'll see that it's now placing this geometry in the highest subdivision level that's assigned to it, which currently is 3. If I go to the middle, it sets it to 2, and so forth. We were at 1, right? Now, I'm going to go ahead and delete the higher versions. So now it's as if there's no subdivisions on this. And so if I wanted to start from scratch and apply a subdivision, I have one of 2 ways to do so. I can either A, hit Control D on my keyboard, and that will go ahead and subdivide it. Or if I undo that, Control Z to undo, I could also just hit this divide button, and it'll basically subdivide it. So right now, I'm going to subdivide. Let's do it to subdivision level of 4. Now you're going to notice it starts to get a lot heavier. If I just go ahead and turn on my polyframe, to do so, right here where you see line fill polyframe, I'm going to go ahead and hit that, and you'll see basically a wireframe of your model. I can toggle that off. The keyboard shortcut for that is Shift F. Okay. So just to kind of show what Z add and Z sub basically represent, I'm going to go ahead and select let's do a damn standard here. Now by default, when I select the damn standard brush, you'll notice that Z sub is activated. That's because, like I said, different brushes will have different attributes that are its default values. I'm going to go ahead and draw down the draw size of this. And if I go ahead and just stroke on this really easy, you'll see that I'm basically carving in. Now it's set to Z sub, so that's what I would expect. I would expect some kind of subtractive operation. Now if I go ahead and switch Z sub to Z add, what I would expect is the opposite effect, which you can see is happening. So one is additive and one is subtractive. So the easier way to manage that, or at least what I try to do, let's go ahead and select our standard brush. Our standard brush is set to Z add. So what I tend to do is if I go ahead and start treating the brush as additive, but I want the inverse effect, you can just hold down Alt, and now you can basically carve in. So it's a little hard to see here, but let me go ahead and just start carving in here. So you can see I'm carving into that geometry by holding down Alt to get the inverse effect. And if you look really closely at the cursor, you'll notice that as I tap Alt, you'll see a minus little symbol become active. So that's how you know you're in an inverse or negative aspect. And of course, I can continue on, just stroking onto the geometry in whatever way I want. Okay. So that's a real brief introduction on the geometry menu and how we're going to basically subdivide our geometry. Now, right now we have 4 subdivision levels on the geometry. Now, one thing to note about this is while those divisions are active on our geometry, at any time, I can basically scrub down to the most basic level. So at this point, going from 4 all the way down to 1, you can see that I'm back to that very basic sphere that we had in the beginning. Now what's cool here, if I go ahead and let's say I grab the move brush, I'm gonna basically make it a broader brush and kind of do like a broad stroke shift to this. Now you'll notice that I'm working symmetrically on this geometry. Now the way that I activated that is just by hitting X on the keyboard. If I hit it right now, you'll notice that I only have that red dot cursor on the right hand side. If I hit X, you'll see that dot on both sides. And that's basically an indicator that you have symmetry turned on. So I just made this broad stroke shift to the geometry. And now what's really cool, if I go ahead and scrub back up to that highest subdivision level that I had, all of that detail that we sculpted in at that level remains intact at that level. So it's really nice. If you want to make broad strokes, it's definitely preferable to work at a lower subdivision level so that you can much easier manipulate the geometry. And then when you're working at the more finer refinements or details, obviously you'd be at the higher subdivision level. Okay? All right. Okay, now let me just stop the recording for 1 second and we will continue in just a sec.